Good morning, everyone. So I hope everyone had a great long weekend. So today my message is titled From Unlikely to Chosen, right? So from time to time, we hear stories about unlikely people who the world considers as probably nobodies, who then went on to make remarkable achievements that many of us can only dream about, even to do just a fraction of what they did. And here I would like to share one such story with you, right? Now, this person became deaf and blind at the age of 19 months old. Oh, not 19 years old, 19 months old, after a bout of illness, right? And most people would assume that she will grow up to be nothing worthy, nobody worthy, and also she will probably be a burden to her family as well as to society. But she proved them wrong. Despite her disability, she learned to read and write, and she became the first deaf, blind person to receive a bachelor's degree. And she didn't stop there. She became an author, a lecturer at a university, and campaigned on issues such as disability rights, social welfare, and impressed many people with her sheer determination and strong will. Her name was Helen Keller, right? And one of her most memorable quotes, at least to me, is this: 4 things to learn in life. To think clearly without hurry or confusion. So if we are in a hurry, we cannot think clearly, right? Because we have no time to sort out our thoughts and to think rationally. And if we are confused, even worse, we also cannot think clearly because there's too many trash in our head and we cannot sort out fact from fiction. Second is to love everybody sincerely. Not to love somebody, but to love everybody sincerely, without any motive, without thinking of receiving some benefits from the person we show our love to. And third, to act in everything with the highest motive. Right? Everything we do with the highest motive. No ill intentions, no ulterior motive, and so on. And last is to trust God unhesitatingly. So, not wavering, not doubting God, but to just simply trust Him without any hesitation. Now, the Bible also has many biblical accounts of people who are considered nobodies at that time, and who went on to play important roles in God's ultimate redemption plan for mankind. And one such nobody was David. Now, before we get to David's part of this biblical account, let us look into the background of today's passage. So by the time we get to 1 Samuel chapter 16, Saul, the first king, had ruled over Israel for between 20 to 25 years. Now, God didn't want to give His people a king, but the people demanded for one because they wanted to be like the nations around them. So God finally conceded and gave them a king. Now, according to human standards or in human standards, Saul seemed like a good candidate for a king. He was handsome, he was taller than anyone else, his family was wealthy and influential. So, in our eyes, or in the eyes of the people at that time, he seemed to be an excellent candidate for a king. Initially, Saul seemed like a good king. He mobilized the scattered nations of Israel to win victories against the attacks of the surrounding nations. However, as time went on, his many flaws showed up. Right? He he was prone to temper tantrums, he was impatient, he was impulsive, he was concerned about his image. So in other words, he was more concerned about what people thought of him rather than what God thought about him. And he was also prone to jealousy, and worse, he disobeyed God on several occasions. Now, although Saul was a natural choice for a king, according to human standards, he failed as a king. So God then sent the prophet Samuel to anoint a new king for Israel. Here we come to David's part. God sent the prophet Samuel to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem to anoint one of his sons to be the next king. So Jesse lined up his sons, right, from the oldest to the youngest for Samuel's inspection. And the first, and of course the oldest, was Liew. And Samuel thought, surely this must be God's chosen. Because he looked a lot like Saul. He was handsome, he was tall, he was strong, a soldier. But what did God told Samuel? 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 7 says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Now, how many of you shop regularly at NTUC Fair Price? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. Oh, not many, surprisingly. So where does the rest of you shop? Cold Storage? Okay. So, online, yeah. Anyway, so those of you who shop at NTUC Fair Price regularly, have you noticed that they sell slightly blemished fruits and vegetables at lower prices? Right? I say you all noticed that, right? So, in 1 year, this initiative actually saved more than 778,000 kilograms of produce that would previously have been thrown away for failing to meet aesthetic standards. Now, the outer appearances of these fruits and vegetables do not affect the flavors and nutritional values. So what I'm trying to say is that the outer appearance does not necessarily determine the inside quality of this produce. And same it applies for human. That's why sometimes we hear the proverb, don't judge a book by its cover. So Jesse's son walked by Samuel one by one, from the oldest to the youngest, right? And God rejected all of them. Until Samuel had to ask Jesse, "Are these all your sons?" And Jesse replied, like an afterthought, he said, "Oh, there's still one more, right? But he's tending the sheep." David's father did not think that David is suitable to be a king either. So some of us can relate to Jesse's behavior. In a family, parents tend to compare their children. I already see some people smiling already, right? So how many of you personally have felt or experienced that your parents tend to compare you with your other siblings or with your neighbor's children or with your parents' friends' children? So whether it is spoken or not, whether your parents say it out loud or not, the feeling is the same. They are usually better than you. So some typical remarks we hear, which when I was young, I also heard myself, personally, directly, all right, like, "Why can't you be like so and so?" Or why you're not as sensible as Auntie Janet's daughter? Or why are you not as smart as so-and-so's son? Right? So these are very typical, and I still see people smiling and nodding their heads. So it is a common thing. So we can relate to Jesse's behavior. So David's father, Jesse, didn't think too much of him either. His reply was, Samuel was like an afterthought. By the way, since you asked that sort of thing. And yet God chose David. When David walked in the door, God told Samuel, that's the one. He's the one I have chosen. God wanted David to be king. David, the shepherd boy, the youngest in the family, where according to Judaism culture, the preference would always go to the firstborn. And David's family was without wealth or influence in their tribe. The most unlikely candidate to be king, and yet God chose David. Why? Because David was a man after God's heart. So 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 14 says, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And in Acts chapter 13 verse 22, and when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will. Here I must make an important clarification. David was far from perfect, right? And the Bible mentions his failures very clearly. But David had a continuing desire to maintain a clean heart with God, as expressed in Psalm 139 verse 23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. David's faith and zeal make him the gold standard for which all other future kings of Israel would be measured against. Men look at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart, just as he looked at David's heart. God does not choose us based on our achievements, or even our failures, or on the opinions of others. Who then does God choose to accomplish his divine purposes? Does God choose the good people, those who come from good family background, or the talented, the well-educated, those who can speak very well? God's standard is very different from the world's standard. The world the world chooses people by measuring their success through their wealth, their credentials, their popularity, maybe how many likes and followers they have on Instagram or Facebook, their fame, and so on. So what the world views as success, God regards it as foolishness. God often chooses nobodies, unlikely people according to human standards. Here are some other unlikely people that God chose to fulfill his purposes. Let's see how many you can identify. First one, who do you think this unlikely person was? Anyone? Just I hear Moses. I heard some more. Abraham, right? So Abraham was a liar. He lied to the Pharaoh that his wife Sarah was his sister. The next one. Someone earlier said Moses, right? Moses was a murderer. He killed an Egyptian taskmaster for beating a Jewish slave. And Moses was also slow of speech. He himself admitted to God that. This one. Oh, sorry. So this one is Jacob. All right, the answer is there. So Jacob was a thief. He stole his brother's Esau's blessing. Right? This one. Rahab, yes, a prostitute. All right, who actually helped Israel inherit the promised land. 2 more to go. The shepherds, right? Not a glamorous occupation. In fact, they was being despised also. And they were the first to learn and share the good news that Christ had been born. And this one? Yes, Peter, James, and John, the 3 disciples that were closest to Jesus. And what were they doing before they became disciples? They were just fishermen. All right? Would you tell your children to say, when you grow up, be a fisherman? Nobody would do that, right? So these are all people that God chose, all right, to fulfill his divine purposes. Here's one more example. Who? Mary, yes. So Mary also was an ordinary girl who probably would have lived an ordinary, mundane life, but God sees her anything but ordinary. And God rewarded her faith, all right? And planned from the very beginning for her life to be anything but ordinary. Mary herself recognized her unlikeliness to be chosen by God when she said in Liew chapter 1, verse 48, "For he, God, has looked on the humble estate of his servant." So there was nothing extraordinary or magnificent about Mary as far as human eyes could see. She was already betrothed to Joseph, so was on the threshold of marriage. And when the angel of the Lord told her that she would become the mother of the Messiah, other than having to face the scorn and the shame for what others would have assumed about her because of her pregnancy, she was also probably unsure, scared about her life, because in those days, the punishment for not being a virgin before marriage could be death. Right? Here we see in Deuteronomy 22, verse 20-21, it says, "But if the thing is true, that evidence of virginity was not found in the young woman, then they shall bring out the young woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death with stones, because she has done an outrageous thing in Israel by whoring in her father's house. So you shall purge the evil from your midst." Yet Mary expressed the ultimate faith in God. When the angel appeared to Mary, instead of expressing shock and fearing for her safety, her response was an indication of her faith in God. Mary said in Luke chapter 1, verse 38, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." So why does God choose these unlikely people, the Abrahams, the Jacobs, the Rahabs of this world? So that his power can be manifested in their weaknesses. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27 said, "But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." God has little regard for those whom the world consider as wise or powerful, because they do not use their wisdom and power to contribute towards God's divine purposes. On the contrary, they usually defy God and His word because they think that they are wise and they are powerful. They can practically do anything they want. We call this the pride of life. So God chose people who are perhaps what the world consider as foolish or weak, all right, by the so-called wise men of this world, so that He can put them to shame and manifest His power. God's strength in our weakness. Have you ever felt sometimes unqualified or inadequate or undeserving of God's salvation? Right? Have you questioned why God would choose you or choose you to serve Him? If so, you are not alone. It's a common struggle, excuse me, and when we look closer at the Bible, it offers us reassurances wherever we struggle with such feelings. The Apostle Paul, grappling with his thorn in his flesh, was told by God, "My grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. When we feel weak or inadequate or powerless, we must remember that it is precisely in these moments that God's power can shine through us. So always remember, when you're in despair, when you feel weak, when you feel you're perhaps good for nothing in the eyes of God, remember that it is when God's power will shine through us. Admitting our weaknesses can be difficult. Why? Because the world sees weak people as failures. When we acknowledge our weaknesses and vulnerabilities, we open the door to God's strength and power. Admitting our weaknesses is not a sign of failure, but a display of our faith and trust in God. I repeat, admitting our weaknesses is not a sign of failure, but a display of our faith and trust in God. Imagine trying to lift something heavy on our own, right? We strain and struggle, but the weight is overwhelming. Right? When we admit that we need help, it is the first step towards overcoming our struggle. Similarly, when we admit our weaknesses and vulnerabilities to God, He is always ready to step in to help us. All right? Jesus already said in the Bible, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." God's strength is not diminished by our weaknesses. In fact, it is through our weaknesses that His strength shines the brightest. When we surrender our weaknesses to God, He will transform them into victories. Now, one such person was Gideon. The Israelites were suffering under the oppression of the Midianites. So when God sent the angel to Gideon, he was actually threshing wheat in secret so that the enemy could not steal it. So when the angel of the Lord said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," Gideon replied, "How is the Lord with us? Why is when all these things is happening to us? God has abandoned us." You can read this in Judges chapter 6. And Gideon further said, "How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you. You will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." But still Gideon, after the angel had spoken to him, Gideon still feel inadequate. He don't think he can do the task that God told him. So he asked God for a sign to show God's power. And God graciously answered. First, he asked God to make the fleece of wool on the ground wet with dew, while the rest of the ground remains dry. And God did. And then the next night, he asked God again to make the fleece of wool dry this time, and the rest of the ground wet. Again, God did. After that, Gideon obeyed God and rescued his people. While initially fearful, Gideon became a mighty warrior who rescued God's people. Now, this account reminds us that God understands our weaknesses. He uses our weaknesses to lead us to depend on Him. Then, through our weaknesses, we can then experience His strength. Our vulnerabilities become opportunities for our growth and triumph, as God works through us to overcome the many challenges that we face in our journey of faith. God's plan versus our plan. God's ways are not our ways. Isaiah 55 verse 8 to 9 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God's plan for us may differ drastically from our own plans. We tend to want to be in control of our life, all right? And we also want to decide what we want to do with it. Because why? We do not feel comfortable. We do not feel confident about entrusting our future in somebody else's hand. What more about God? Okay? Because we cannot see Him, we cannot feel Him. So, when we pray to God for something, perhaps for a life partner, or for our choice of school, for our next career move, are we willing to actually accept God's answer, especially when His answer does not make sense to us at that point in time? Right? Are we ready and prepared to surrender our plans and submit to God's plan instead, and simply just trust Him, like Helen Keller said? All right, trust God unhesitatingly. One biblical example, all right, is found in the account of Paul's second missionary journey. Right. Paul and Silas had wanted to go to a place called Bithynia in the northeastern part of Asia Minor. You can see the yellow star there, all right? But God changed their plan and led them to Macedonia, the one with the red star, all right? And it was through this that the gospel eventually reached the whole of Europe. So God's plans has a greater purpose beyond what we can imagine. Another change of plan took place towards the end of Paul's third missionary journey. Paul had wanted to go to Rome after he visited Jerusalem, but he couldn't carry out his plan because he was arrested in Jerusalem and had to remain in Caesarea for several years. But he finally did go to Rome and didn't have to pay a single cent for his trip, because he was taken to Rome to face Caesar to answer for the charges made against him by the Jews. So God's plan always turned out to be far better than ours. The third point I want to raise is chosen by grace. In today's message about God's choosing unlikely people, we must remember that He chose us out of grace, not because we earn it. It is because of His magnanimous grace and not something that we do to be chosen. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 8 to 9 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." A young man went to his pastor with a problem one day. And he told the pastor, "Pastor, you urged me to read the New Testament. I have read the 4 Gospels, I've read the book of Acts, and now I'm reading the book of Romans. But I cannot accept chapter 9 in Romans. I do not like what I read, especially in verse 13, because it says, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Right? This was what God said. So, I can't accept or believe in a God like that. So the pastor waited for a while and said, well, I also have difficulty with this verse as well. So then the young man felt comforted somewhat, thinking that he found someone who agrees with him. And then the pastor continued, well, my problem is not that God could hate Esau, a man who despised his own birthright, a man who had no thought for the things of God, and a man who cared only for himself. My problem, the pastor said, is how could a God of justice and holiness love a liar and a thief like Jacob? And the young man stopped puzzling over God's treatment of Esau and marveled at God's grace towards Jacob. So in conclusion, let us recap some of the key points that I covered today. The first one is God chooses the unlikely. The next time we think God would never choose us, remember these truths. God doesn't see us as the world does. In His eyes, we are chosen, valuable, and loved. God made you the way you are for a purpose, and He loves you just the way He made you. Now that we know this, we will be able to carry out our God-given tasks with joy and confidence, knowing we are chosen and loved by the Creator of the universe. Second, God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. Whenever we feel inadequate or unqualified, let's remember that God doesn't need us to be perfect or that we have it all together. He simply asks us to follow Him and trust Him. Admitting our inadequacy is not a sign of failure, but a display of our faith and trust in God. Number 3, God's plan is superior than ours, as mentioned in Isaiah 55, verses 8 to 9, which we read earlier. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Number 4, God's grace in choosing us. God chose us because of His abundant grace. God doesn't make mistakes. He has chosen us for a purpose, and with His grace and guidance, we are more than capable to fulfill His purpose. So take heart. God has chosen us. He will empower us with everything we need to fulfill His purposes. And finally, God looks at our hearts. Just as Samuel eventually learned not to look at outer appearances, may we, with God's help, examine our own hearts, our own thoughts and intentions. In all that we do, pray to God for Him to use us for His purpose wherever He has us serve Him. Whether it is a small task like maybe greeting someone in church, or a bigger task like shepherding God's people. God is still looking for people to accomplish His divine purposes today. Can we say we are people after God's heart? So today is the start of a brand new week. So I'll leave this last slide with you for us to meditate upon or reflect upon.